So we have three main variables that we're interested in macroeconomics: the growth rate of GDP, the unemployment rate, and the inflation rate. And in this video, we're going to introduce the two main ways that these variables are related to each other. So first we have Okun's law, which relates GDP growth and the unemployment rate. And then we have the Phillips curve, which relates the unemployment rate and inflation. And, sometimes we'll add in, like the quantity theory of money, but that's not necessary. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester. So first we're going to start off with Okun's law. And so Okun's law basically says that when output growth rate is faster, that's our horizontal axis variable, output growth, so just GDP growth, then the unemployment rate goes down, right? So that makes sense. We're producing more, we need more workers, so more people are coming out of unemployment, the unemployment rate is going down. And then, of course, when output growth is lower, right, and even negative in recessions, then the unemployment rate is going up. And so this is data from 1960 to 2014. And you can see it's not perfect, right? Nothing in economics is ever perfect. We never have points that always lie along the line exactly, but for macroeconomic data, it's quite good. And when we compare this to the Phillips curve, it looks really quite excellent. So just keep this in mind, right? Okun's law, when output growth rate is higher, the unemployment rate is coming down. When output growth is lower or negative, the unemployment rate is going up. One thing to keep in mind is that this line here, this line at 0, says that we need about 3% GDP growth to keep the unemployment rate constant, right? And if we have 0 growth, then the unemployment rate is actually going to increase by about a percentage point. And the reason for that is that we have productivity growth going on all the time. And so we're able to grow with fewer workers, at least some. And if we want to employ more workers, we're going to grow even faster. So obviously this was named after a fellow named Arthur Okun. And we see that it's downward sloping. The slope of that line that we just looked at is about minus 0.4, which means that on average, an increase in the growth rate of 1 percentage point, right, decreases the unemployment rate by minus 0.4 percentage points. This should be a little bit clearer. We're in percentage points here, and so that's what our change is. And as we said, the line crosses the horizontal axis around 3%, so that means we need 3% growth just to keep the unemployment rate constant. And that's because of both productivity growth, as I mentioned, and also population growth. Unemployment and the inflation rate is related by the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve is a little bit less clear, right? So here we have the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis, and we have the change in the inflation rate. As you can see, the relation is not as tight. It was, tighter in the 1960s, fell apart almost completely in the 1970s and 80s, and then came back somewhat in sort of the 90s, 2000s, and up till now. Although it's definitely flatter than, say, it was in the 1960s. But basically what this says is that when the unemployment rate is higher, inflation is going to be going down, right? We'll have disinflation. And when the unemployment rate is lower, the inflation rate is going to be going up. So we'll have positive inflation and faster inflation. But keep in mind, there's a lot of points that are not that close to this line. So it's not a really tight relationship. When he first did his paper, right? When he first wrote his paper and he was looking at this, he was looking at data from the United Kingdom where inflation tended to average around 0. And for a lot of the data that he was looking at, countries were on the gold standard. And so they couldn't increase their money supply as easily as we can now. And we find in that type of situation, the data fits together much better. Now we have both sort of a more positive inflation and a more flexible money supply, and that seems to mean that the trade-off is not quite as clear. In our graph, the line crosses the horizontal axis where the unemployment rate is equal to about 6%. So that means, that's the rate of unemployment where inflation is positive. If we looked at it, just in the last, say, 20 years, I think that would be more like 4 to 4.5%. Because, what we consider to be, and we'll talk about this in later chapters, the natural rate of unemployment, which is really that unemployment rate where we don't have pressure on inflation to go up or down, that seems to have gone down, compared to, say, the 1960s and 70s. So the final thing we want to talk about in this chapter is, we're going to spend a fair amount of time thinking about the short run, the medium run, and the long run. And so what is that, right? One thing I think is important to keep in mind is that we're always in the short run. We're always in now, which is always the short run. And this is the year-to-year movements that are mainly driven by movements in demand. And so when demand goes up, unemployment's going to tend to go down. We may have higher inflation. When demand goes down, unemployment's going to tend to go up. We may have lower inflation. And that's where we always are. That's every few years, right? We think about the business cycle with recessions and expansions. In the medium run, the economy tends to go, back to where we were. Now, the thing about the medium run is that we never really get there, right? Because we're always in the short run. What we really want to think of the medium run as is the sort of location that we're being pushed to in the short run, right? Where are we being pushed based on how much capital we have, how many workers we have, the level of technology? That's the medium run. And then in the long run, right, we're always in the long run too, but only when we're looking, in terms of decades. And that's really about growth and innovation. And that's going to depend on how innovative the economy is, how much we're able to invest in capital and new capital. It may be related to the savings rate, although in the United States that relationship is somewhat tenuous, but I think we could at least say on a global scale, in order to invest in capital, we need to save and not consume. But it's also going to depend on things like education and human capital, right? And, the rule of law in a country and how well the government manages the economy. And that's going to be really important in the long run, but of course in the short run, we may have things that overshadow that long run growth.